budge on that at all. And of course, he had opportunity to do that. Tsai Ing-wen is not, okay, so she's kind of dismissed the 1992 consensus, but she has talked about the spirit of the consensus in a way that could have left the door open potentially for some, for some messaging. But I didn't get any of that messaging out of there. So it tells me that it probably wasn't Xi Jinping necessarily saying, we can work through this, let's be creative kind of thing. I think it's more of the last one. That's this idea that it's a bit of a warning that both to Taipei and to Washington, because of the centrality of Washington to Beijing's Taiwan strategy, that hey, the past 8 years have been really good, and there's a danger that could be reversed, and so be very careful. And I really think it was more of that. Then turning to sort of, okay, so what about the paradigm itself, the 1992 consensus? I mean, unfortunately, this could be, given the fact that the KMT is in such a disarray at the moment, and that the DPP potentially could have a very, very big win, the presidency and the legislature, that could be the first and last time that there's a pretty, even despite its vagueness, that there's still a pretty firm kind of paradigm for leaders on both sides of the strait to hang their hat on. So this could be it. We could be entering a period where, unless leaders on one or both sides get very creative, we could be in an environment where there's not something like that to fall back on. And there really haven't been. There's been what, 23, 24, whatever the number is. I'm no expert in this area, but sort of cross-strait agreements that fall into the primarily economic to the economic cultural realms. But even with the 1992 consensus, there hasn't been any creative paths paid toward political dialogue. So it doesn't make for a very good transition from one party to the next. Following an election, particularly a major one like this, it could be so transformative. So let's do a little comparison, because I do think it's kind of important. If you go back to 2000 and 2008, this is the last time that I guess you would hear, the Chinese being pretty clear about this being a highly dangerous period. I haven't seen a lot of that same rhetoric this time, and I asked the question at the very end here, why the absence of clear signals regarding PRC expectations? I could be missing it because, again, I'm following, on a daily basis, following much more the military and security side of the house than I am the political. But it doesn't seem, there was a lot of signaling prior to the 2008 election when it looked like the Kuomintang would come into power, a very good development for Beijing from their perspective, but a bit closer than we are this time in terms of how the outcome might come. So maybe that rhetoric was because it was close. Beijing felt like we don't want a repeat of sort of the missile crisis and that kind of obviously coercive kind of activity, but we still want to send strong signals, and they did that. And then following that July of 2007 decision, sort of at the cabinet level, to pursue UN membership under the name Taiwan, you really saw that pressure, both in rhetoric and in some activity, really did ratchet up. And of course, again, as I mentioned earlier, I believe Beijing's Taiwan strategy is very much focused on Washington, and I think that a lot of that rhetoric was really focused on Washington, and it was really asking, at that time, the Bush administration to be very clear to Taiwan, to Taiwan's leaders, that they were going down a path that the U.S. wasn't particularly happy with, and I think that message was conveyed pretty clearly. And again, I think that was the calculus then in Beijing's mind that said, it's a dangerous period, but we're probably okay because our strategy of having Washington keep Taiwan in the box is working, because Washington was making the right noises at that point in time. But there still was some nuanced signaling that punishment could follow if things went bad, if there was a lame duck activity that they didn't like, even after the DPP won, after the Kuomintang won. And then I think importantly, following the election, you had the DPP, formerly ruling party, that went out of power, which is what we're going to see again probably, if the polls hold. But so the ruling party is out, but I say here it really wasn't down. I think the DPP showed and maybe the KMT could do this over the next few years as well. But the DPP really showed an adaptability after that election. Tsai Ing-wen, I think, learned a lot, as did the others in her, in her senior circles. They still have a lot to manage internally in terms of the party and its alliances, but they did learn a lot. And it was really a party that I think was poised then to, over the course of the next 8 years, to really be a pretty, powerful political entity. And the question is, will the Kuomintang, in sort of a two major party system with the other parties, allied, will they be able to do something similar to that over the next few years? And I have some theories on that as well. I think it's going to be tougher than it was for the DPP, to be quite honest with you, if they can't really kind of rally around some central leadership and central themes fairly quickly, something that they haven't really shown the ability to do in the last year or so. So then looking at the current time, again, the idea of promoting status quo in a time of transformation. The economy's big here, and again, that will affect potentially the numbers from this election in terms of how big the DPP wins, because the KMT is unpopular for many reasons. But when you're unpopular and you're also viewed as not really helping out the economy and the pocketbooks of your voting populace, it's not a good thing, not a good outcome. But it's also demographics, and it really, there really are demographic changes. The polls will move in various directions, but it takes someone who's a lot more sophisticated in understanding the nuances of polling than I am to really get at it. But I do believe that that the changes are pretty significant in terms of identity politics in Taiwan, and how increasingly the idea that of Chineseness and of the ability to accept some of the rhetoric out of Beijing about the Chinese dream, et cetera, is increasingly unpalatable on Taiwan, and that was definitely evident when I was there on this last trip. I also think, again, the DPP, just from my perspective, a very big change is that they do have a defense policy. I think Ike Bottalon was going to waive it. I don't know if I kept it out. If you haven't read if you're not poised for a DPP victory, which appears all but certain, then you need to be. And they put out a set of defense policy blue papers. I bought on number 5 just to wave around, because this is the one that really talks about the threat that they're facing. And if you're going to put out a defense policy and you don't define the threat very well, particularly if you're Taiwan, you don't have a good base to stand on. But this is actually a very good threat assessment, of the balance of power across the strait, and it informs the other blue papers that they've put out. I think it's 12 in total, that really describes what the DPP plans to do. We'll talk a bit more about maybe some strengths and weaknesses of their approach, but in general, it's a pretty good series of documents to become familiar with, and has some things in there that I think are informed by folks in the field, both in Taiwan and in the United States and elsewhere, who know what they're talking about when they warn Taiwan not to be too attracted to shiny objects, and to really think about what they need to credibly deter Chinese aggression against the island if, in fact, a crisis or friction were to escalate. And that's what they really need to be worried about. We already talked about the Kuomintang. Can the party really transform? I leave that as a question mark. I don't know. I mean, obviously they can, but it's tough, and I think it's going to be tougher than it was for the DPP in the past 8 years. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. And certainly Beijing will want to play a role in that. And I think we were getting that signal, again, from some of the academics from China we talked to. They were really stressing this idea that, that Xi and others in China want to make sure there's still a viable, nationalist party on Taiwan that they can work with. And again, I would love some comments from folks here who are watching this maybe more closely than I. Again, comparing this to the 2007-2008 period, I don't see as much clear signaling to Washington about what Beijing's expectations are vis-a-vis Taiwan. What pressures do they expect us to put on potentially a new DPP government? Maybe they figure that that's just very obvious and there doesn't need to be a lot signaling, but I haven't seen a lot of it. Okay, I mentioned the principles that are at play here, and they are at odds. The bottom line principle, under Xi Jinping, I believe that sort of this idea of the bottom line principle is actually hardened. As he has consolidated his power and most recently, did something that his two predecessors probably would have liked to have done over the past 2 to almost 3 decades, and that's reorganized the PLA. He obviously has shown to be powerful enough to do that, and I believe that's very indicative of his ability to consolidate power and to control the direction of the party and of policy. And I believe that his positional core interest is hardened. So again, didn't see much evidence in the Ma-Xi summit that he's opening some specific door where, okay, DPP, you're going to win. Now let's start thinking about what can we hang our hats on to sort of maintain peace and stability. Didn't see a lot of that. So you have, I think, a growing determination to impose costs on people who get in the way of, and the governments that get in the way of China's interests. Now, this has been, I think, primarily non-military, obviously. Things like the banana embargo and some of the costs that were imposed on on Great Britain after meeting with the Dalai Lama, things like that, that are showing that China is going to respond, and impose some costs. And again, it's been primarily non-military, but as their military becomes more capable, you have to keep an eye out about when they might use that tool and how they might use it. And I think that's married with an enhanced capacity to shape regional and international environments through various mechanisms. And I won't go into detail on this. I've got a backup slide, but obviously everyone is very much focused on a lot of the economic levers and organizations that Beijing has created or co-created. I don't think to replace trying to replace the post Bretton Woods structure right now, but certainly to provide alternative venues, forums for Beijing to exercise more leadership and to shape both the regional and the international environment. And I think they've been very successful thus far at that. And we'll see how things go with TPP and maybe some of that. I mean, TPP is a very, I think it's going to be a very important and I think telling tool. If and when that's realized, it will be interesting to see Beijing's response, to see whether, how the rest of the region responds to Beijing not being in that, how it sort of meshes with Beijing's ideas of RCEP and other kind of architectures. But it really is the economic part of our rebalance to the Pacific, and I think it's going to be pretty important to see that. But China has, through their own mechanisms, been very successful in kind of beginning to rearrange how the region looks at relationships, and increasingly how the globe looks at relationships. When you look at the EU's response to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and things like that, it's Beijing is wielding a fair amount of power in some of these new organizations. Looking at the principle on the other side of the strait, I think the principle really is strategic ambiguity. Should sound familiar. And that is meant to, again, to keep the status quo. But is it really? What's going to hold things together? Tsai pictured there talks about the sort of the 3 benefits and 3 commitments, that sort of underpin the status quo, and that's all good and well. Man, I've lost some words there. But I think that both sides of the strait, what that's supposed to say, I think that there will be an expectation of more. In other words, right now the change, the political change is important to the people in Taiwan. Obviously, they're going to go to the polls, probably improve that. But once they have a party that's ruling and in power, there's going to be an expectation that they manage relationships with manage the relationship with Beijing. It's going to be it's going to be more than just, well, we want to get rid of the old. Then you're going to have somebody in charge, and there's going to be an expectation that it's going to have to be something more than just some rhetoric to base the relationship on. And certainly China is going to expect more, not just China's leadership, but obviously the China populace as well. It's going to expect that their government will respond to what they may see as unacceptable actions by a new Taiwan.